Our next talk is by John Gluckman and Aron Finholt, Reason and Result in Kinyamulenge.
Right. So hello, everybody, and welcome. My name's Aron Finholt. I'm here with my colleague and advisor, John Gluckman. And today, we're going to be talking about our project entitled Reason and Result in Kinyamulenge. So today, we discuss our ongoing project investigating causal dependencies between clauses, specifically causal dependencies between a main clause and two types of adverbial clauses. Now, the first being reason clauses, or adverbial clauses that provide a reason for the eventuality or situation. The main clause in English introduced by because, right? And second, result clauses, right? Or adverbial clauses that provide a result of the eventuality or situation, the main clause, right? In English, again, introduced by something like so that. Right? And the reason why we investigate these sorts of causal dependencies is because recent work has shown that there are a range of complex issues, specifically concerning perspective in both reason and result clauses, something which is fundamental to Charneval's work, which we'll discuss a bit more later on. So we specifically investigate this issue of perspective in reason and result clauses in the Bantu language Kinyamulenge, which is a closely related language to or dialect of Kinyarwanda. And our main observation is that Kinyamulenge appears to lexicalize the distinction in perspective in reason and result clauses using two different complementizers, specifically the complementizer ko and ngo. Right? Specifically, the complementizer ko seems to indicate the attitudinal perspective of the speaker, whereas the complementizer ngo instead indicates the perspective of an event participant who's not necessarily the speaker. Okay, so a brief outline of our talk. We'll first provide a very brief background on Kinyamulenge before digging into the data on reason and result clauses, and then I'll hand the mic off to John, who will walk through our analysis and some subsequent pros and cons about our analysis. Okay, so Kinyamulenge is a dialect, quote unquote, of Kinyarwanda that's spoken in South Kivu, the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's mutually intelligible with Kinyarwanda and Kirundi, as well as Kinyabwisha and Rufumbira, though, of course, its status as a dialect is controversial. It is also reported as a distinct language in and of itself. And so it is worth noting in this context that the speakers of Kinyamulenge, the Banyamulenge, are heavily oppressed in South Kivu, and are considered outsiders in the region despite having lived there for centuries. And so this fact, on top of this notion of Kinyamulenge being a dialect of Kinyarwanda, has led to very little formal documentation on the language. Though fortunately for us, the data that we'll talk about today was actually collected right here in Kansas, working with a fantastic native speaker who represents a large number of resettled Banyamulenge refugees in and around the Kansas City area. So here you can see a map of South Kivu in the Congo. It's right on the western border of Rwanda and Burundi. So turning now to the linguistic properties of Kinyamulenge, it can be said that Kinyamulenge is a typical Bantu language, right? And as such, exhibits a base word order of SVO, though the surface word order can vary based on information structure, right? In addition, Kinyamulenge also exhibits an extensive noun class system in addition to extensive verbal morphology in the form of extensions, right? Both of which are typical of Bantu languages. Moreover, like other Bantu languages in the area, specifically in South Kivu and Rwanda, Kinyamulenge also exhibits a number of different tenses and aspects, right? So we can model both the word order and some of the morphological properties of Kinyamulenge in an example like one, right? Paul will cook goat for Mary. Here we have future tense marking and the applicative extension in the verb complex, as well as some class marking on goat here. Right? Okay, turning now to reason and result clauses, starting with reason clauses, right? So the relationship that we're trying to capture with reason clauses, right, is one in which the situation or eventuality of the main clause is construed as causally dependent on a reason clause, right? So we can see this in two. John went to the hospital because Mary was sick, right? Here, it is the main clause, John went to the hospital, that is understood to be causally dependent on a reason clause, because Mary was sick. That is, because Mary was sick is the reason or the cause of John's going to the hospital. Right? Reason clauses have been reported to come in different flavors, right, depending on the temporal overlap between the main clause and the adverbial clause. Though we will note here that this really doesn't appear to have an effect on the data that we'll talk about in Kinyamulenge. So basic reason clauses or default reason clauses in Kinyamulenge involve two distinct components, right? First, the optional subordinator kubera, something like because, and then the obligatory complementizer ko. Right? So we can see this in 3. John went to the hospital because Mary is sick. Or we see that the reason clause because Mary is sick is introduced by this optional subordinator kubera and the obligatory complementizer ko. Right. And note that this adverbial clause, the reason clause here, can either precede or follow the main clause, but in both cases, we still get these two components, the optional subordinator and the obligatory complementizer ko. Like I suggested it a bit earlier, right? Kinyamulenge does have another complementizer in Go, and we do find that reason clauses may also be headed by the complementizer in Go. But this yields a particular reading, specifically a reading in which only the subject of the main clause believes the adverbial clause to be true, right? So sticking with the same sentence, John went to the hospital because Mary is sick. If the reason clause is instead introduced by and go, this yields a reading in which only John believes that Mary is sick, right? So it in effect has, it distances the speaker from the truth of the adverbial clause, right? So here, this is compatible with a context like in 4, right? John heard that Mary's sick, so he decided to visit her in the hospital, but everyone, including the speaker, knows that Mary was never sick, right? She was just faking and happened to convince John. Again, Ngo here encodes that only John believes Mary is sick and distances the speaker from the truth of the adverbial clause. We will note that in reason clauses, Ngo appears to require some other modal element, whether that be the subjunctive final vowel E as we see in 4, or an overt modal verb. It seems to coincide with some extra modal element in the reason clause. And so because of this distancing effect that we see with Ngo, right, Ngo reason clauses are actually compatible with contrastive continuations in which the speaker overtly denies the truth of the adverbial clause, like in 5, right? So that is, we can follow John went to the hospital because Mary was sick with, but she's not sick, so long as because Mary was sick is introduced by Ngo. Right? Conversely, with a co-clause, right, we find that 5 is infelicitous, right? Co-clauses seem to commit the speaker to a belief in the adverbial clause and are therefore incompatible with these sorts of contrastive continuations in which the speaker overtly denies the truth of the adverbial clause. In contrast to reason clauses, right? Clauses which only reflect speaker-oriented epistemic knowledge, right, like sense clauses, do not show the same alternation with ko and ngo. In fact, sense clauses may only appear with ko, right? So in 6, Mary must be Kinyamulenge since she speaks Kinyamulenge, only ko is available, right? And this makes sense given the previous data because with reason clauses, Ngo really seems to be distancing the speaker from the truth of the adverbial clause. And since sense clauses only reflect speaker-oriented epistemic knowledge, this would be incompatible with this sort of distancing effect. Turning now to result clauses, right? We essentially get the opposite relation of a reason clause. So with result clauses, it is the situation or eventuality of a result clause that is construed as causally dependent on the main clause, right? So in 7, John went to Kigali so that he could talk to Mary. It is so that he could talk to Mary that's understood to be causally dependent on John went to Kigali. Just like reason clauses, result clauses are also reported to come in different flavors, though again, we do not find that this has an effect on the data in Kinyamulenge. We will also note that we're only interested in finite result clauses. So we'll set aside any discussion of non-finite result clauses like purpose clauses, rationale clauses, or TLIT clauses. And so in contrast to reason clauses, right, basic result clauses or default result clauses in Kinyamulenge involve, again, an optional subordinator, this time kubira, and then crucially the complementizer ngo. Remember, with reason clauses, the default complementizer is ko. Here with the result clause, the default complementizer ngo, right? So there's a mismatch in the default complementizer between reason and result clauses, right? So we can see this in 8. John put the computer in the library so that everyone can use it, right? The result clause here is headed by the optional subordinate kugira, and then the obligatory commentizer ngo. And so 8 here really illustrates a typical use of a result clause in the sense that it describes the intentions of a volitional entity, here John, that's in the main clause, right? That is, the intention of John putting the computer in the library is so that everyone can use it. However, in the absence of a volitional entity like John, we find that the complementizer co may actually head a result clause, right? So in 9, the computer is in the library so that everyone can use it. There isn't a volitional entity in the main clause, right? And so we find that the result clause may be introduced by this complementizer co. We do, however, find a minimal pair between co and ngo in result clauses, specifically in examples like 10. Right? And crucially, these sorts of alternations really seem to suggest that the difference between co and ngo is one of perspective. Right? So in 10, Mary is so tired that she cannot study. Right? With co, right? This seems to be an observation about Mary. This is an observation that the speaker makes about the real world. Right? Mary's so tired that she cannot study. Maybe she's completely stopped studying. Perhaps she's even fallen asleep. Right? This is an observation on behalf of the speaker. Right? However, with ngo, this is instead an observation about Mary's mental state. Right? So here, she just doesn't want to study. Maybe she's still studying, but she really can't focus. Right? One thing we will note here that we currently can't account for and present some issues in examples like 10 is that these sorts of result clauses actually don't contain any overt negation. And we are not quite sure how to account for this. So we can certainly come back to this in the question and answer period if any of you would like to revisit this. Okay, so in summary, right, we have 2 different observations on this data. Right? The first being that reason and result clauses differ in the particular complementizers that they prefer, despite being able to use either complementizer, co or ngo. Right, so specifically, reason clauses seem to default to the complementizer co, though again, ngo is possible, it just yields a particular reading, whereas result clauses instead prefer the complementizer ngo, though again, co is possible, particularly in contexts where there isn't a volitional event participant in the main clause. The second observation is that co and ngo seem to encode a difference in perspective. Right? Specifically, co appears to encode speaker belief or speaker perspective, whereas ngo instead encodes somebody else's belief or perspective. And so our analysis ultimately hopes to capture both of these observations, while at the same time paving the way for uses and descriptions of co and ngo outside of reason and result clauses. John, you're muted, I think.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, so our analysis is going to take as its starting point Isabelle Charnevel's 2019 analysis of reason clauses, mainly looking at English. And her main contribution here is to argue that reason clauses, because clauses, involve 2 perspectival loci. What she claims that there is a causal judge, J, and a logophoric center, L. And these are doing 2 different things. The causal judge, J, this evaluates the causal dependency between the 2 clauses. And so in root clauses, the causal judge must include the speaker, that is the closest attitudinal center, and may also include an event participant of the main clause. And this needs to be distinguished from the logophoric center, and the logophoric center just evaluates the attitudinal content of the because clause. And the logophoric center, that could be the speaker, that is the closest attitudinal center. It also could be an event participant, not the speaker, or it could be both at the same time. Charnevel comes up with a lot of motivation for disassociating these 2 perspective positions. And one of them has to do with putting epistemic modals inside of this because clause. And so she gives examples like 12. So Liz left the party because things might have spiraled out of control. And so here we find a dissociation between the causal judge and the logophoric center due to that epistemic modal in the because clause. So here the causal judge of 12 is both the speaker and Liz. Both of these people, if you ask them why Liz left the party, they could tell you an answer. They would tell you it's because of the possibility of things spiraling out of control, right? But only Liz is the logophoric center here, right? Because we're just talking about, with might in that adverbial clause, we're really just talking about the epistemic possibilities relative to Liz's epistemic state, not the speaker's epistemic state, right? And so data like this illustrate that we really need to have these two sort of perspectival positions in reason clauses. Right? So if we just take this basic system and we apply it directly to Kinyamulenge, we actually get a nice result. What we'll just say is that the difference between ko and go just reflects who is the logophoric center here, and has nothing to do with the causal judge. And so what we can say is that ko, that reflects a logophoric center, which includes the speaker, or maybe a little bit more formally, the closest attitudinal center. Whereas in go reflects a logophoric center, which is bound by some main clause event participant, and doesn't necessarily have anything to do with being bound by an attitudinal center. Right? So formally, what we'll do is we'll define a modal complementizer, which displays perspective-based allomorphy. So here in 14, I'm giving you, the complementizer really just looks like a run-of-the-mill sort of doxastic predicate. And it just quantifies over doxastic states relative to L, a logophoric center. And what we'll say is that this comp is realized as ko when L is bound by the closest attitude center, and it's realized as in go when L is bound by some other event participant, not necessarily the closest attitude center. Okay. We'll further define two causal connectives, so reason and result. Both of these will be evaluated relative to a causal judge. So in reason, reason takes two propositions and it evaluates them relative to this causal judge J, and it just says, according to the causal judge's relevant knowledge, the reason that the main clause holds is true is that the adverbial clause is true. Okay. And result does just the opposite thing. So it's going to take two propositions, and it says that according to the causal judge's relevant knowledge, the result of the main clause being true is that the adverbial clause is true. Okay. And we're just going to assume that reason and result have allomorphs. The allomorphs of reason are kuvera and null, and the allomorphs of result are kugira and null. This essentially forces us to, we want this because we want them always to be in the tree. And so sometimes they're pronounced and sometimes they aren't. We will have nothing more to say about the causal judge. We're happy to talk about this later. We don't think that this is reflected in our data whatsoever. So we have no more comments about it. Happy to talk about it. Okay, so just showing you how this would work. So if we go back to our original example here, so we have something like John went to the hospital because Mary is sick. In our LF, we're going to have the causal judge J. We have the reason morpheme. We have L, the logophoric operator, and then we have ko and either ko or go with comp. Right. And so if you use ko, what you're saying is that according to the speakers in John's relevant knowledge, that is, they are the causal judges here. The reason that John went to the hospital is because for all that the speaker and John know, Mary is sick. Right? We're just quantifying over both the speakers and John's beliefs here. They believe that Mary is sick. The minimal difference here between using ko and go is that the speaker is no longer this logophoric center. So we're no longer quantifying over the speaker's doxastic state. It's just John's doxastic state. Right. And so here we're saying that according to the speakers in John's relevant knowledge, the reason that John went to the hospital is that for all John knows, Mary is sick. Right. And so this works to distance the speaker from the truth of the adverbial. Right. The result clauses essentially do the opposite. And so here, this is our example from earlier again. Mary is so tired that she can't study. Ko, again, this is quantifying over the speaker's doxastic state. So what we're saying is that according to the speakers and Mary's relevant knowledge, the result of Mary being tired is that for all the speaker knows, she doesn't study. And go minimally differs in not including the speaker here. And in fact, it is precisely the opposite. It only includes Mary here. And so in go would be something like according to the speakers and Mary's relevant knowledge, the result of Mary being tired is that for all that Mary knows, she doesn't study. Now, I think right away, I think you can point out a problem here is that result clauses don't seem to reflect doxastic states in so much as they reflect desires or intentions or preferences. And so our analysis as is a little bit suspicious because we're saying that this complementizer is always reflecting a doxastic state, and it's sort of not, and so it's not really getting that extra meaning of result clauses. We of course recognize this as a problem, but we think this is a very solvable problem because if you'll recall, in Go clauses, they really need some other modal element inside of them. So they really like to occur with subjunctive or maybe some other overt modal. And so I think our thinking here, though it is not fully worked out, we're not going to give you formal semantics to this, but our thinking here is that the subjunctive, that can contribute this extra desire or preference or intention. And so there's a few ways to do this. We like the ideas that have been recently put forth in Marian Portner and Rubinstein. The ideas actually go back go back a ways, but they essentially take what you do is you take a belief state and then you can order that belief state, those beliefs relative to your desires or preferences or intentions. And so this would be the function of the subjunctive in these Go clauses, and that would get us this extra sort of desire meaning in here. Okay, so just to sum up, like as an interim summary before I get to the pros and cons, our first observation was a usage observation. We found that reason clauses, you get a preference, so just default reason clauses you like co, but in Go is possible, and then for default result clauses you get the opposite preference. So in Go is preferred, but co is possible. And so our solution here is really just sort of a pragmatic solution. Reason clauses tend to correlate with co if typical usage just involves reasoning on the part of the speaker. So when you use a because clause, you're really just talking about things that the speaker can subscribe to in order to reason about. For result clauses, you get the opposite thing because these are often describing the intentions or motivations of an event participant. You're going to prefer Go. Go is going to be the one that you're going to go with because that really you're talking about what that event participant wants to do. But of course, if you don't want to talk about what an event participant wants to do, then you can use co as well. So this is just a purely pragmatic explanation. In contrast, the meaning observation, which is that co encoded something like speaker belief, whereas in Go encoded something like someone else's belief. This is hardwired into the meaning of the complementizer. So co is anchored to an event center, an attitude center, I'm sorry, and in Go is anchored to an event participant. And so we've just stipulated this into the meaning, and this is how we're getting the meaning distinction. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the goods and bads of what we're doing here. One good thing that this is just the same as in Charnevel. We find that reason clauses may exhibit a perspectival shift in embedded contexts. So recall that what we're doing with co is we're sort of anchoring this to a local attitudinal center. And so we predict then if we embed this into an attitude environment, we should be able to shift co to not having speaker-oriented meaning, but rather reflecting the attitudinal, the now more local attitudinal center. And this is in fact precisely what we find. So I've just taken the sentence that we've been looking at. So John went to the hospital because Mary was sick. And I've put this under an attitude verb Bill. And so now this can in fact reflect a belief on Bill's part that Mary is sick, which may not actually be true. So this is a nice outcome of our analysis, and it's essentially the same as what Isabel has argued as well. The second, you take this as a pro, although there's more things to look at here. When we look at co and Go outside of the adverbial use, when we look at them when they're heading selected embedded clauses, we find a very similar distinction. So if I have a sentence like Mary knows that I went to Kigali, co and Go are both available here as heading this selected embedded clause. And we get what looks like almost precisely the same speaker distancing as we got before. So if I use co, what you get is essentially a fact of inference. I'm in Kigali and Mary knows it. So Mary knows a fact. Within Go, Mary has a false belief. This means something like think. Mary thinks I'm in Kigali, but I'm actually not. And so this is in line with what we're saying in that co and Go sort of reflect a distancing on the part of the speaker. Although we will acknowledge that this introduces additional complications about the most local attitude center, because clearly Mary here is an attitude center, and so it's not totally clear how you're going to get the speaker to bind co here. But this is still sort of in line with the general gist of the analysis. We do want to emphasize that co and Go do not encode a factivity distinction. So you may suggest, 20 may have suggested to you that Ko and Go reflect factivity per se. They do not. So you can get these under these purely anti-factive verbs like possibility modals. So I can say things like, it's possible that John is at Mary's coffee shop. Ko and Go are both perfectly acceptable in this context, or in this sentence. And Ko would mean, Ko gives something like a higher probability, like you're more sure, whereas Go is, 50-50. Okay, and so we think there's one very difficult piece of data for us. I mean, there's a lot of difficult pieces of data for us, but there's one very, very difficult piece of data for us. And that is the fact that Go has a secondary, very productive use as a hearsay or reportative or indirect evidential. So in 22, it's absolutely fine to say something like Ngo Maria yagiye Kigali. So, Mary went, the asserted content here is Mary went to Kigali, and you get this inference of I heard. So if we learned anything from Natasha's talk yesterday, these are very, very complicated. And we think it's not obvious how we would derive this particular meaning here, particularly because what we said is that Go really needs to be anchored. It is bound. It involves some sort of binding mechanism. And it's not clear what it will be bound to in this context. And I will point out that this is not just a quirk of Kinyamulenge. This particular facet of these complementizers is found across a bunch of the Bantu languages in the area. And so this really is probably a bigger issue that needs to be addressed. Okay, just summing up here. So what we do find is general support for Charnevel 2019. So Kinyamulenge seems to provide support for the idea that reason and result clauses involve multiple perspectival loci. And then we also find that the complementizers in Kinyamulenge, they encode a shift. They encode some sort of perspectival shift, which we've characterized as a binding by an attitude center versus binding by an event participant. We want to point out sort of two avenues of future work. One is that, I've shown you one example of Ko and Go heading a selected clause, but we really intend this work on adverbial clauses to be sort of like an inroad into figuring out what's going on in the selected clauses, which involve many, many more complicating factors here. And so taking what we have here, I think we can sort of begin to flesh out a little bit more of the complications that go on there. The second avenue of future work is between Kinyamulenge and Kinyarwanda and Kirundi, there's a few sort of quote unquote dialects. Ko and Go occur in all of them. And can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, well, I wrapped up, so my internet died at just the right time. All right, thank you. We'll take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that, but
No, I apologize. Sorry for the internet.
we have time for questions. Let's go to Natasha.
Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. I have an empirical question and an analytical question. So empirically, about your example on slide, your example 17, slide 24, have you looked at dese? So is there any difference?
We have. Aron, do you remember what the data are for this?
You can take this one.
Yeah, so
like 7
yeah,
abbreviation effects, basically.
Yeah, so we have looked at, we haven't looked at, let me revise that. We haven't looked at de se. We looked at de re de dicto ambiguities in this context. De se would be interesting. We should probably look at that. You're right.
Because I think that it could be the case that Ngo requires that Mary is consciously aware of whether or not she's studying. And with 17A with Ko, maybe you can have co-reference without self-awareness. And that we know, like, there's lots of literature on this. So that's what I'm asking about. And also your analysis predicts dese because you treat it as a logophoric center.
It does. Yeah. Yeah, my intuition is that probably would hold up. I suspect that is what we'd find for in this particular example, but there are more complicating examples that probably wouldn't work out so well. But yeah, we should look at the data. Yeah, thanks. And then you had something else, I think, analytical question.
Can I ask another question, or do you have more questions?
Sure, a quick question. Yeah.
A quick question. Why do you need judges?
Oh, okay. Yes.
I'm sorry.
It's a loaded term. I understand that it's hard to mention the word judge these days without getting. So I think maybe Aaron and I, we could talk about this, but I think we're using this as a very neutral term, just as how Chauneville uses it, and just saying like there is some sort of person who can evaluate something, and we're not making a claim about what the particular properties of this individual are, if this should be grouped together with judges in terms of like predicates of personal taste, or something like that. I think maybe that's a morass we don't really want to wade into, particularly because our data, I don't think, really comment on this. Yeah,
it's just here it seems like we really get it from the syntax. It's either the speaker or the event participant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, or I mean, it could be both.
We can talk later.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, Augustina.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. That was very interesting. I have a comment, not a question. So this reminds me of work that Ken does with Lubukusu actual clauses, he calls them. So where like you have a clause that actually marks that the speaker believes that the complement is true versus whether the speaker has no claims about the complement. And I was wondering if you've looked at those and if there are any connections with these actual clauses.
Yeah, so I have looked at those. As far as I can tell, Lubukusu, well, okay, so there's two languages that I know that have the actuality clauses. So Lubukusu and Chibemba both have actuality clauses. All the other languages that I'm aware of, even the closely related languages to Lubukusu, so Nyala East, language I've worked a lot on, does not have these actuality clauses. I don't know what to say about them. They have a very different morphosyntactic profile because it looks like mood. These things they're not encoded in the complementizers, even though Lubukusu has a very, very rich complementizer system, richer in fact than Kinyamulenge is. So I haven't had the ability to look specifically at the actuality clauses in Lubukusu, but yeah, I think you could probably make a case that they are similar. Off the cuff, I would say that maybe what you'd want to say is something actually along the lines of what Mari and Portner and Rubinstein have said, of maybe sort of encoding this into the mood system and sort of getting this linked up to like, so they link it up to the common ground, and then you can link it up to and then quantifying, ordering the common ground. And so I think that might be a really good inroad into analyzing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's go to Josh.
Cool, thanks. That was obviously super interesting data. I have a couple of questions. Firstly, just empirically, like a clarification question. Can 17 also receive a reason reading?
I think pragmatically, no. I think if we tried to force it to, yeah,
so it can't mean she's tired
because
she's been reading, or because she's been studying so much?
Yeah, I think that, that's a good question. Aaron, do you know the answer to this? I want to put you on the spot. But...
I don't think so. I mean, my intuition say no. I mean, I think that like these sorts of result clauses, as we briefly mentioned, like present some other issues that like we don't know how to account for. Because like, I mean, even if you don't have an overt subordinator in this context, like you still get this negation reading, even though we don't have any overt negation in the result clause. And so, I mean, I'm not sure if we'd be able to yield the reason clause.
So it'd be pretty bad to put like Kuvera in that at the head of the like judge clause or whatever, or result phrase or whatever, like that would be bad pragmatically for them, or
I don't know, maybe.
Yeah.
No, that's a good question. We should have this data point. You're right.
Yeah.
yeah, right, because I mean, like that result clause or reason clause need not be negated, right?
Yeah, I mean, the other complicating thing here is that like you can have overt negation here. Like when I've like this is, you know, if you ask how to translate this is what they'll give you.
Yeah.
But I've asked like what if I put overt negation in here? He's like, oh yeah, it's fine. Yeah, that means the same thing. And
yeah.
So
Right.
So
yeah, there's going to be some sort of QUD kind of thing that you probably want to appeal to. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I guess that was one question. I'm gonna choose one more. Yeah, you were sort of appealing to like Portman Rubinstein a bit. Have you like considered the Yanakidu account? Because like the distribution and the meaning of ngo is quite similar to the Greek subjunctive from my memory, this na, which is also a complementizer, which also turns up heading up matrix clauses and does this kind of interesting modally work. I mean, not identical surely, but like there, yeah, it felt like the similarities were kind of jumping out there for me, more like as in this Balkan type subjunctive much more than the Romance types. So I was wondering if you had like thought about a comparison between na and ngo and yeah, or anything like that. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I will confess that we are wading through this literature. This is a pretty deep literature, and it's a little bit outside of my purview. But yeah, we you know, we're sort of juggling a lot of different ideas that could potentially work here. But the idea that that the ngo and ko are linked to like what in Romance or maybe Indo-European is encoded in the mood system. I think this idea is right. I think we're trying to figure out like what is the right mapping to make between these two things. One of the things that we liked about the Portner and Mari and Portner and Portner and Rubinstein is that, which I'm not sure that Giannakidu does, but maybe you can correct me, that they have a story that links it to the common ground a little bit more. Whereas I think Giannakidu is I think that it doesn't have this extra component, and we like this linking to common ground because we think, for just anecdotally, that there is evidence to believe that ko at least has some sort of like discourse tie. But it's possible that Giannakidu also says this, but we just don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, finally, let's go to Malta.
Yeah, thanks very much. Great talk. This is more a curiosity question that's potentially catering to my own interests. So, so the question is concerns embedded interrogatives. The question is, does the language have embedded interrogatives, or because many African languages they go with a nominal relative strategy, and if so, do you also have these complementizers? And if so, you could perhaps have another interesting case of like this the semantic effect of the switch between ko and go, which concerns the interpretation as strong or weakly exhaustive, right? So and the only time you ever see a difference between strong and weak exhaustive is when the speaker and the attitude holder have different information, right? So the attitude holder doesn't know it's the complete list. I mean, he knows the complete list of answers, but he doesn't know it's the complete set, but the speaker does. So if all these preconditions were met, you would have potentially a really interesting case to check for this difference, right? So
that's fascinating. Yeah, we have data on embedded interrogatives, and Aron, I can't remember, but are both complementizers available? Can you remember?
I cannot remember.
I can't remember either, but I want to say that they are, but your idea that this weak exhaustivity, that's interesting. This is again not a literature I'm super familiar with. So
this research project, and even in German you see a text when you like change between first and third person matrix subject and so on. But so if you like, we could discuss this more on some other occasion, right? But that would be ever so cool if you.
Yeah, That would be great. Yeah, that's a really good line to pursue.
I'll get back to you about it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's wrap up there and thank the speakers again.